So today we're going to be taking a look at the nitrogen cycle and drawing a picture of it, just like what we did last class where you drew the carbon cycle, and in last class's Google Doc for the nitrogen cycle, you put your carbon cycle diagram here in the space. But today we're going to look at the nitrogen cycle. And as we're going to draw the nitrogen cycle, we're also going to review the answers for the homework that was due yesterday night. For the activity 2 for nitrogen cycle on this fill in the blanks. So you need to get a piece of paper and make sure you draw these diagrams out. And it's going to be good for you to have these diagrams because it'll help you to study for the quiz that we'll be having in our next class. So here we have the nitrogen cycle, and we have nitrogen gas in the air. Nitrogen is really important because it helps us build certain molecules like proteins in our bodies and things like nucleic acids, which help us form, which examples of nucleic acids are like DNA. So nitrogen is important for all living things. The thing is, nitrogen gas in the air, even though there's so much nitrogen in the air, we can't use it in that form. So the nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, like I said, is not usable for organisms, so we have bacteria in the root nodules of legumes that turn nitrogen from the atmosphere into ammonia in a process called nitrogen fixation. So here there are special plants, and in their roots there's areas called nodules where bacteria live. And the bacteria will go ahead and change that nitrogen gas that nobody can use and fix it to a form called ammonia. And that's my memory clue for you. Nitrogen fixation, it's like these special bacteria will start the process of fixing nitrogen gas that nobody can use into forms that other organisms can use. Now, that ammonia is toxic for some organisms. Some organisms can use it, but really for others, we can't use ammonia. So we need the help of other bacteria in the soil to turn that ammonia into different types of nitrogen called nitrites and nitrates in a process called nitrification. So here we have the ammonia, we have different type of bacteria that will change that ammonia to better forms of nitrogen so that other organisms can use it. And that process, like I said, is called nitrification. Now, okay, now that it's in the soil, the good nitrogen is in the soil, then plants can absorb that nitrogen from the soil, and that process is called assimilation. So here we have the nitrates and the nitrites, and the trees and the other producers can take up the nitrogen that will help them to grow and develop. And that process is called assimilation, when they take up the good nitrogen from the soil. Now that the plants have nitrogen in their bodies, now they can pass that nitrogen over to the consumers through the food chain or food web. So when animals eat plants that have nitrogen in their bodies, then now the animals can get the nitrogen in their bodies, and it can keep passing on to other animals too through the food chain. And then eventually, okay, organisms will start to die. And even though they die, they still have nitrogen in their dead bodies. And then also waste. When organisms let out waste, there's nitrogen there. So we have organisms called decomposers that'll break down the dead and decaying things and the waste. And the nitrogen that's in the dead organisms and the waste, the decomposers will actually let that nitrogen go up into the air, and it'll be nitrogen gas. And that process is called denitrification. So they're kind of, these decomposers are reversing the process. All that nitrogen that's in the dead things and the waste, they'll turn it back into nitrogen gas. So if you can see, it's kind of like a cycle here. There's nitrogen gas, it's not usable. Special bacteria have to change it into ammonia. Other bacteria have to change it into better forms of nitrogen so everybody can start to use it. The plants get to the nitrogen first, the good nitrogen, then the animals, and then decomposers let nitrogen gas back up into the air when they break down dead and decaying things. Now, we have things called fertilizers, and fertilizers are good because they help producers to grow. There's good nutrients in them. There's carbon and there's also nitrogen in those in the fertilizers. But the thing is, when it rains or snows, when there's precipitation, that fertilizer that helps, let's say, gardens and crops to grow, it'll wash off into a nearby, let's say, lake, river, or stream. So that's not a good thing because it's going to cause the producers in the water to grow a lot, and specifically algae. Okay, algae are going to grow uncontrollably, and in the next process that we're going to talk about, which is eutrophication, when that happens, when all of these nutrients and nitrogen go into the water, it's going to actually cause a dead zone. Okay, it's gonna cause a chain reaction of events to happen, and it's gonna actually cause organisms to die because there's not a lot of oxygen. So that's what we're gonna be taking a look at the next drawing. So get out a different sheet of paper, and we're gonna draw this process of eutrophication. So here for eutrophication, like we said, we have the fertilizer. It has lots of good nutrients like nitrogen. And the thing is, even though it's helping crops and gardens to grow, when we use so much of these fertilizers and let's say it rains, it'll wash off into a nearby body of water, okay? And when that happens, okay, the algae grows. So I have this green line and it shows algae. And that algae will grow. And when they grow, they actually grow at the top of the water and they will use up all the sunlight, and they're going to grow so much that after a while, since there's so much algae, they're going to block the sunlight. So usually the sunlight will go to the bottom all the way through the, through the water so that plants underneath can go ahead and get the sunlight to make their own food. But here, the algae block the sunlight, so they're taking up all the sunlight. And I'm sure you've seen this before. If you've seen in a nearby lake or pond, let's say a Branch Brook Park, let's say the water is really green, that green stuff is actually living things, it's algae. So when you see a lake or a pond, something like that, that's really, really green, that shows like this process is happening. There's lots of nutrients, let's say like fertilizer that got into the water, and this process of eutrophication is happening. Okay, so, well, the fertilizer helps the algae to grow and they're blocking the sunlight. They're taking up all the sunlight. Why is that bad? Well, then the plants who live underneath at the bottom, they're not going to get the sunlight. And if they don't get the sunlight, they can't do photosynthesis. And if they can't do photosynthesis, they can't make their own food in their body, so they're going to die. So because they're not getting sunlight, they're going to die. And eventually the algae are going to die too. There's going to be too much competition. So here the X's here show on the green algae, it shows that they're dying. And the reason for that is they're competing for resources like space, for let's say the sunlight, whatever it is. Since there's so much of them, they're going to compete. Remember, in a competition, there's a winner and there's a loser. And because there's so much of them, they're going to run out of resources. Okay, they're going to go past their carrying capacity. All right, so we got a lot of dead things here and decomposers, and I have these dots here to represent the decomposers in the water. Decomposers will break down the dead plants, they'll break down the dead algae, and in the process, they're going to use up a lot of the oxygen that's in the water. Well, because they're using up a lot of oxygen in the water, all the poor organisms that live in the water that need oxygen, they're going to start to die because there's not enough oxygen for them. So here, this whole process causes, just because the fertilizer gets washed up into the water, it causes this chain reaction of events, and eventually it causes organisms to die. I'm going to show you a video of, explaining eutrophication. All right, so that is the process of eutrophication and also um, the nitrogen cycle. And what you're going to do in today's Schoology, you have this link, nitrogen cycle and eutrophication. And just like what you did for the carbon cycle in a previous Google Doc, you're going to take a picture. You can use your phone and then email it to yourself, or you can use your laptop to take a picture. And this area right here, this is where you're going to put the nitrogen cycle. Okay, and then this area over here is where you're going to put the eutrophication picture. All right, so make sure you submit that and make sure, remember, next time we see each other, we're going to have a quiz on nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, and you should be able to understand or know the process of eutrophication.